Survivors, welcome back to another tale of survival in a world gone mad. Thank you for joining us to hear this story. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to our channel. Your support keeps us going, and we're grateful for every one of you. In the comments below, drop the name of the city you're listening from. It helps us map our community's reach across this shattered world. Now, let's begin. The road sign emerged through the morning mist like a tombstone. Silent Falls, Pop 347. Someone had spray-painted a red X through the numbers. My legs trembled as I read those familiar letters. 30 days of walking through hell finally bringing me back to the place I'd been forced to leave behind. The weight of my backpack cut into my shoulders. But it was the rifle slung across my chest that reminded me how much had changed. An M4 carbine taken from the wreckage of a military convoy I'd stumbled across 3 days north of here. The soldiers were all dead, some torn apart by infected, others by their own hands when the ammunition ran low. Dad had taught me to shoot when I was 12, out behind the house with his old .22. "Respect the weapon, Denzel," he'd said, his big hands guiding mine on the stock. I wondered what he'd think of me now, carrying military hardware through the ruins of our hometown. I stood at the edge of Silent Falls, staring down Ridge Road toward the cluster of houses that marked the town's eastern border. 30 days ago, I'd been herded onto evacuation buses with hundreds of other terrified residents, watching my entire world disappear through scratched plastic windows. The memory hit me like a physical blow. October morning, sirens wailing across the valley. Mom shaking me awake, her face pale with panic. "Get dressed, honey. Get dressed now. We have to go." Dad in the hallway, stuffing documents into a manila envelope with shaking hands. The radio crackling with emergency broadcasts. Immediate evacuation of all residents. Temporary relocation centers. This is not a drill. I'd grabbed my jacket, my phone, $20 from the jar on my dresser. Nothing else. We thought we were coming back in a few days, maybe a week at most. The buses were already full when we reached the evacuation point at the high school. Mom held my hand so tight it hurt as we climbed aboard, her wedding ring cutting into my fingers. Dad sat across the aisle, staring out the window like he was memorizing every detail of our neighborhood. "Don't worry," he'd said, voice thick with an emotion I didn't recognize then, but understood now as grief. "We'll be back home soon. This will all blow over." The first houses came into view through the November haze. Mrs. Whitaker's place with its distinctive blue shutters. The Rodden family's 2-story colonial with the wraparound porch. Both looked wrong somehow, like photographs left too long in sunlight. Windows dark, yards overgrown, no signs of life anywhere. I unslung the rifle, checking the safety out of habit. Dad's training had never left me. Even through 30 days in hell, the weight felt foreign yet familiar, like putting on clothes that no longer fit quite right. Mrs. Whitaker's roses caught my attention first. She'd been so proud of those flowers, spending hours every morning with her watering can and pruning shears, coaxing impossible colors from the New England soil. Now they were brown, twisted things, thorns reaching through the chain-link fence like arthritic fingers. Her mailbox stood open, bills and advertisements scattered across the dead lawn by weeks of wind and rain. The silence pressed against my eardrums. In the old world, Silent Falls had hummed with quiet activity, lawnmowers on Saturday mornings, dogs barking at postal trucks, the distant murmur of traffic on Route 9. Now there was only the whisper of wind through broken windows and the creak of settling wood as houses slowly surrendered to gravity. I moved down Ridge Road, stepping carefully around debris. A child's tricycle lay on its side in the middle of the street, one wheel spinning slowly in the breeze. Someone had spray-painted "Help Us" on the side of a minivan. The letters faded and streaked with rust-colored stains I didn't want to examine too closely. The safe zone had been a lie. Concrete walls and razor wire couldn't keep out desperation, couldn't hold back the hunger that drove people to do unspeakable things. I'd watched neighbors turn on each other over scraps of moldy bread, seen families torn apart by accusations and paranoia. When the infected finally broke through the perimeter, it was almost a relief. At least their hunger was honest. I'd run when the screams started, abandoning everyone and everything in a moment of pure animal terror. The shame of it burned in my chest like acid. But the alternative had been death, or worse, becoming one of them, shambling mindlessly through a world I no longer recognized. The rodent house drew my attention as I passed. Their front door hung open, revealing darkness beyond. Something about the angle bothered me. Too neat, too deliberate, like someone had propped it open and walked away. I approached cautiously, rifle ready, but not quite aimed. The porch steps groaned under my weight, wood swollen from weeks of autumn rain. Inside, I could hear something moving, a soft scraping sound like furniture being dragged across a floor. The living room was a disaster zone. Overturned chairs, scattered magazines, a television lying face down on the hardwood floor. But it wasn't random destruction. There was a pattern to it, as if someone had been searching for something specific. The scraping sound came again from deeper in the house. Kitchen maybe, or the basement stairs? I stepped through the doorway, boots crunching on broken glass. Family photos lined the hallway walls. Graduation pictures, vacation snapshots, a wedding portrait of the young couple who'd moved in 3 years ago. All of it normal, mundane, completely at odds with the devastation surrounding it. The kitchen door stood ajar. Beyond it, I could see movement, a shadow passing back and forth across the yellowed linoleum. I'd known the rodents casually, the way you know neighbors in a small town. Tom worked construction, drove a big Ford pickup with tool racks in the back. Lisa taught second grade at Riverside Elementary, had a laugh that carried across 3 yards when she was working in her garden. They'd bought the house right after getting married, full of plans and dreams and quiet ambitions. Where were they now? Had they made it out on the evacuation buses? Were they safe somewhere, wondering what had happened to their home? Or were they like so many others, statistics in a disaster too large to comprehend? Names on lists that no one would ever read. I pushed the kitchen door open with the rifle barrel. Lisa Roden looked up at me with empty sockets where her eyes should have been. She'd been beautiful once. Auburn hair, freckles across her nose, smile that could light up a room. Now she was something else entirely, a grotesque parody of the woman who lived here. Her teacher's clothes hung in tatters from a frame that had withered to nothing but skin and bone. She moved toward me with that horrible broken gait they all shared, arms outstretched like she was reaching for an embrace. The sound coming from her throat wasn't quite human, a wet rattling that might have been my name, or might have been nothing at all. I raised the rifle, sighted down the barrel, found her center mass. Dad's voice in my memory, breathe, squeeze, follow through. But my finger hesitated on the trigger. This was Lisa. She'd always waved when I walked to work, always asked about my parents when she saw me around town. The hesitation nearly killed me. She was faster than I'd expected. Crossing the kitchen in 3 lurching steps, I backpedaled, bumping into the doorframe, and her fingernails rad across my jacket sleeve. Close enough to smell her decay and something worse, something that made my stomach lurch. I pulled the trigger. The rifle bucked against my shoulder, and Lisa jerked backward like she'd been yanked by invisible strings. The shot was loud in the enclosed space, ringing off tile and cabinet doors. She stumbled, but didn't fall. Black fluid spreading across her chest where the bullet had torn through. Center mass wasn't enough. It never was with them. I fired again, this time aiming for her head. The back of her skull erupted in a spray of dark matter, and she dropped like a stone. Lisa Roden, second-grade teacher, lover of gardens and weekend morning coffee, reduced to a pile of meat on her own kitchen floor. But the damage was done. The gunshots had announced my presence to anything within half a mile. Already, I could hear answering calls in the distance, the low moans of infected drawn by the noise. I had to move fast. The back door was closest, opening onto a small yard enclosed by a privacy fence. I vaulted over the kitchen table, stepped around Lisa's body, and burst into the cold November air. Behind me, more sounds came from inside the house. She hadn't been alone. The yard was overgrown. What had once been a neat vegetable garden now choked with weeds and dying vines. A swing set sat rusting in one corner. They'd been planning for children, maybe, or already had them. I tried not to think about what might have happened to kids in a house where their mother had become that thing in the kitchen. I scaled the privacy fence, dropping into the neighboring yard just as something crashed through the rodent's back door behind me. Multiple somethings, drawn by the gunfire and my scent. Their frustrated moans faded as I put distance between us, working my way through backyards toward the town center. The evacuation had been chaos. Hundreds of families crowded into yellow school buses. Children crying, adults shouting questions that no one could answer. I'd pressed my face to the window as we pulled away from the high school, watching Silent Falls shrink behind us. The last thing I'd seen was smoke rising from somewhere near downtown, a thin black column reaching toward gray October skies. "Where are we going?" someone had asked. "North," the driver had replied. "Safe zones north of Boston. Government's got it all set up. Food, shelter, medical care, everything we need until this blows over." But it hadn't blown over. It had gotten worse. And the safe zone? The safe zone had been a trap disguised as salvation. Main Street opened before me like a wound in the heart of the town. Half the storefront stood empty, windows smashed or boarded over. The other showed signs of hasty looting, doors torn from hinges, merchandise scattered across broken glass. Miller's Hardware, where Dad had bought lumber and nails for weekend projects. Goldman's Pharmacy, where I'd picked up Mom's prescriptions. The Sunrise Diner, where high school kids had gathered after football games to argue about college and futures that would never come. All of it was gone. Not destroyed exactly, but abandoned, hollow, like a movie set after the camera stopped rolling. I worked my way down the sidewalk, rifle ready, scanning windows and doorways for threats. The Texaco station where I'd worked sat at the end of the block, its pumps dark and lifeless. The sign hung by a single chain, swaying gently in the November breeze. My first real job, minimum wage plus tips, mostly from tourists heading to the state park, or locals who remembered when full service actually meant something. I'd started there when I turned 16, saving money for college, for a car, for all the normal things teenagers wanted. Mr. Litton had been a decent boss, fair, patient with my mistakes, willing to let me leave early when homework piled up. I'd been working that morning when the first reports came through the radio. Local stations going off the air one by one. Emergency broadcasts cutting through normal programming. Then the phone stopped working. Mr. Litton had sent everyone home early. "Go to your families," he'd said, hands shaking as he locked the cash register. "This will blow over by Monday." The station looked exactly the same from outside. Same faded signs advertising cigarettes and lottery tickets. Same crack in the front window that Mr. Litton had been meaning to fix for 2 years. But something felt wrong. The front door stood slightly open, revealing darkness beyond. I approached carefully, listening for sounds from inside. Nothing but the whisper of wind through the gap in the door. I pushed it open with the rifle barrel and stepped inside. Everything was exactly as I'd left it 30 days ago. The register sat open, cash drawer empty, cigarette packs scattered across the floor. The coffee machine still had a pot of what had once been Colombian roast, now a black, moldy sludge that filled the air with a sour stench. Behind the counter, my name tag still hung on its little hook. Denzel, assistant manager. A crash from the storage room made me freeze. Something was moving back there, knocking over shelves. Multiple somethings. Judging by the sounds, they'd found shelter in the familiar darkness,
drawn by scents that lingered from better times. I backed toward the front door, not eager to repeat what had happened at the Roden house. 3 shots left in the current magazine. 2 full magazines in my pack, enough to get by if I was smart about it, if I picked my fights carefully. But this was where I'd worked for 3 years, where I'd learned responsibility, earned my first real paycheck, dreamed about futures that seemed possible back then. Some stupid part of me wanted to clear them out, to reclaim this small piece of my past. The smart play was to leave, circle around, find another route through town. But the infected in there would eventually wander outside, and then this whole block would be compromised. Better to deal with them now while I could control the engagement. I moved to the storage room door, rifle raised. Through the gap, I could see shapes moving in the darkness. At least 3, maybe more. The air that seeped through reeked of decay and worse things. Dad always said that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was doing what needed to be done despite being afraid. Fear keeps you alive, son, he told me after my first hunting trip when I'd frozen up with a buck in my sights. But you can't let it make your decisions for you. He'd been right then. He was right now. I kicked the door open and stepped into hell. 3 of them turned toward me with the synchronized precision of predators sensing prey. What had been Mrs. Carey stood closest, her kindly grandmother's face now a ruin of missing flesh and exposed bone. Behind her, 2 men in work clothes, their movements jerky and wrong. I put the first shot through Mrs. Carey's forehead, dropping her instantly. The 2 men rushed me together, faster than I'd expected. I caught the first one center mass, but the second was already on me, his weight carrying us both into a shelf full of motor oil. Cans crashed around us as we hit the concrete floor. His teeth snapped inches from my throat, black saliva dripping onto my chest. The smell was overwhelming, death and rot and something else, something that made my lizard brain scream in terror. I managed to get the rifle between us, using it as a lever to push him back. His fingers clawed at my face, leaving bloody scratches, but I could feel him weakening. Whatever drove them wasn't unlimited. They could wear down, slow down if you fought them long enough. A knee to his midsection gave me the space I needed. I rolled out from under him, came up with the rifle, and put a bullet through his skull before he could recover. Silence settled over the storage room like dust. 3 bodies lay among scattered merchandise and spilled oil. What was left of people I'd known, neighbors, customers, fixtures in the small world that had been Silent Falls. I reloaded, hands shaking more than I cared to admit. 6 rounds fired, 34 remaining. I'd have to be more careful, more selective. Ammunition was survival, and survival meant making hard choices about when to fight and when to run. The sun was higher now, burning through the morning mist to reveal the full extent of Silent Falls' devastation. From the gas station's front window, I could see clear down Main Street to the old Methodist church where the steeple still stood straight and proud. Between here and there lay a maze of abandoned buildings, overturned cars, and shadows deep enough to hide anything. The memory came unbidden. Sunday mornings in that church, fidgeting in uncomfortable clothes while Reverend Walsh delivered sermons about faith and perseverance. Mom on one side, Dad on the other. The 3 of us a complete unit in a world that made sense. After service, we'd drive to the Sunrise Diner for pancakes and orange juice, and Dad would read the sports section aloud while Mom and I argued about which movie to see that afternoon. Simple times, safe times, times when the biggest threat was boredom, and the greatest fear was that nothing would ever change. How wrong we'd all been. I stepped back outside, leaving the gas station to its ghosts. The rifle felt heavier now. Weighted with the knowledge of what I'd had to do, what I'd have to keep doing if I wanted to see tomorrow. The town stretched before me, familiar streets leading to familiar places that were no longer safe, no longer home.
But somewhere in this maze of memory and nightmare, answers waited. The truth about what had happened here, what had happened to the people I'd known. Maybe even the truth about what I was supposed to do next. I started walking, boots crunching on broken glass, carrying 30 days of survival and a lifetime of loss toward whatever was left of the place where I'd grown up. Behind me, smoke began to rise from the gas station storage room. Something had caught fire, spilled oil maybe, or an overturned space heater. The flames would spread, consume the building, erase another piece of the world that had been. I didn't look back. In this new world, nothing stayed the same for long. Everything burned eventually. The flames behind me cast dancing shadows across Main Street as I walked away from what remained of my first job. The smoke would be visible for miles, but there was no helping it now. The afternoon sun hung lower in the November sky, and I had maybe 2 hours before darkness fell. Riverside Elementary appeared through the bare branches like a monument to innocence lost. The red brick building where I'd learned to read, suffer through multiplication tables, gotten my first bloody nose in a fight with Oliver over a girl whose name I couldn't even remember now. But something was wrong with the picture. Terribly wrong. The school parking lot was full of vehicles arranged in neat rows, all facing the building like an audience waiting for a performance. Someone had organized this after the initial panic had ended. Moved these cars with deliberate purpose. I approached cautiously, rifle ready, scanning windows for movement. The front door stood wide open, revealing darkness beyond. A handwritten sign hung crooked on one door. Processing Center, authorized personnel only. The paint was faded, streaked with rain and time. The chemical smell hit me first. Formaldehyde mixed with industrial disinfectant, sharp and burning my nostrils like liquid fire. Inside, the hallways were empty, but arranged with disturbing intentionality. Classroom doors stood open at precise intervals. Desks facing the corridor instead of blackboards. Someone had repurposed this place, turned it into something it was never meant to be. My footsteps echoed on polished linoleum as I made my way deeper into the building. The walls were still covered with children's artwork, crayon drawings of houses and families and sunny skies that seemed obscene in this context. Happy faces smiled down at me from construction paper, innocent and unaware of what their school had become. October decorations hung from classroom doorways, paper pumpkins and smiling ghosts. A bitter reminder of normalcy interrupted. Each classroom had been converted into a different stage of the process. In Mrs. Nick's old second-grade room, metal tables replaced the child-sized desks. Stainless steel surfaces gleamed under fluorescent lights. Surgical instruments laid out with medical precision. This was the preparation room where bodies had been cleaned and readied for preservation. The next classroom held supplies, rows of embalming fluid, industrial chemicals with warning labels in multiple languages, boxes of latex gloves and surgical masks. Someone had organized a full mortuary operation here, complete with drainage systems jerry-rigged to the school's plumbing. Room after room revealed the scope of the operation. A record-keeping station where death certificates had been meticulously filled out and filed. A storage area where bodies had been temporarily held before processing. Even a small chapel of sorts in what had been the music room, complete with folding chairs arranged around a makeshift altar. This hadn't been the work of a single person. This was an organized effort, a community decision to preserve their dead with dignity, even as their world collapsed around them. The gymnasium doors were propped open with wooden blocks. Beyond them, rows of bodies lay on the basketball court where I'd once cheered at games and attended school assemblies. The bodies were arranged with military precision, each one dressed in their Sunday best, preserved with obvious care and respect. Mr. Howland from the bank lay in the front row, still wearing his three-piece suit, the same one he'd worn to every town council meeting for the past decade. His hands were folded over his chest, and someone had placed his reading glasses in his breast pocket, a small detail that spoke of personal knowledge, of love. Mrs. Brammer from the library occupied a place of honor near the center, her gray hair carefully arranged around a face that looked younger than I remembered. She'd been the one who'd helped me find books about dinosaurs when I was 7, who'd let me hide in the stacks when kids at school were being cruel. Row after row of familiar faces, each with a small placard written in careful script. Not just names and dates, but personal details. Beloved husband and father, taught Sunday school for 30 years, never met a stranger. Someone had taken the time to document not just their deaths, but their lives, their contributions to the community. 60 or 70 people laid out like they were attending some final ceremony. The basketball hoops had been draped with black cloth and flowers, real flowers, somehow kept fresh, decorated the perimeter of the court. This wasn't just storage for the dead. It was a memorial, a shrine to the silent falls that had been. Mom had been volunteering here when the outbreak started. She had called me from the school's landline, voice tight with worry. "Something's happening, honey. They're making all the teachers lock their classroom doors. The children are scared. I'm scared." That had been the last time I'd heard her voice. I walked between the rows, searching faces that had been cleaned and prepared with obvious care. Each person looked peaceful, dignified, like they were simply sleeping. But I knew better. I'd seen too much death in the past 30 days to believe in peaceful endings anymore. I didn't find her among the preserved dead, a small mercy, or maybe just delayed grief. Part of me had been preparing for this moment since I'd entered the building, steeling myself for the sight of her face among the corpses. But she wasn't here, which meant she was either alive somewhere or dead in a place I hadn't found yet. Near the back of the gymnasium, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. Children's backpacks and lunchboxes were stacked in neat piles against the wall. Dozens of them, each one representing a life cut short or transformed into something unrecognizable. The bright colors and cartoon characters seemed obscene in this place of death and preservation. I left the school behind and made my way toward downtown, toward Murphy's Tavern, where I'd spent countless Friday nights after work. The brick building sat on the corner of Main and Cedar, its neon sign dark and half the letters missing. The windows were boarded up with plywood, but someone had torn a hole through one of the boards big enough for a person to climb through. Inside, the bar was exactly as I remembered. Scarred wooden tables, mismatched chairs, the smell of stale beer and cigarettes that had soaked into the wood over decades. But the customers were all still there, sitting in their usual spots, dead. All of them dead. Oliver sat at his regular stool, head down on the bar like he'd passed out drunk. But the back of his skull was caved in, dried blood pooling around a baseball bat that lay beside him. Next to him, Danny slumped forward in his chair, throat torn open by something with claws or very sharp fingernails. They hadn't died from infection. Someone had killed them, recently, judging by the smell and the condition of the bodies. These were the guys I'd graduated with, the ones who never left Silent Falls. Every Friday after work, we'd gather here to complain about jobs and girlfriends and the general unfairness of small-town life. Oliver had been saving money to propose to his girlfriend. Danny had just gotten promoted at his dad's construction company. We'd had plans, dreams, futures that seemed guaranteed back then. Now they were corpses in a tomb that reeked of violence and desperation. Another piece of my past reduced to meat and memory. I heard movement upstairs, floorboards creaking, the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. The tavern had apartments above it where old Murphy had lived before his heart gave out 2 years ago. Someone or something was up there, and from the sounds they were making, they weren't trying to be quiet about it. I climbed the narrow stairs, rifle ready, each step producing a creak that seemed thunderous in the silence.
The hallway was dark, lit only by gray November light filtering through a window at the far end. 3 doors led off the corridor, all slightly ajar, like whoever had been here last had left in a hurry. The dragging sound was coming from the middle room, accompanied now by wet, tearing noises that made my skin crawl. I'd heard sounds like that before in the safe zone, when desperation had driven people to do things that would have been unthinkable in the old world. I pushed the door open with the rifle barrel and stepped into what had once been Murphy's living room. Now it looked like a slaughterhouse. Blood covered the walls in arterial sprays, dark and dry to the color of rust. Pieces of what might have been human bodies were scattered across the overturned furniture. An arm here, a leg there, chunks of meat that had once been people I might have known. A man crouched in the corner, gnawing on something that had once been an arm. He looked up at me with eyes that held no recognition, no humanity left in them at all. His face was smeared with blood and worse things. His clothes torn to rags, foam and saliva mixed with blood around his mouth, and he made a low growling sound deep in his throat. But I knew him. John, who'd worked at the post office for 15 years, who'd coached Little League on weekends and never missed church on Sunday, who'd always asked about my parents when I came in to buy stamps. He snarled and lunged at me with animal fury, moving faster than should have been possible for someone in his condition. I put 3 rounds center mass, the rifle bucking against my shoulder. He dropped immediately, body jerking once before going still. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there breathing hard, looking down at what remained of a man who'd been a pillar of the community just 30 days ago. This was what we became when the rules stopped applying, when hunger and fear stripped away everything that made us human. John had been a good man once, someone parents trusted with their children, someone who'd organized charity drives and volunteered at the food bank. Now, he was just meat returning to meat, reduced to his most basic instincts. How many others had made the same transformation? How many of the people I'd grown up with had become monsters in the name of survival? I backed out of the apartment and down the stairs, leaving Murphy's Tavern to its ghosts and its horrors. Outside, the shadows were growing longer, and I could hear movement in the distance, the shuffling gait of infected, drawn by the gunfire. 3 shots in quick succession would carry far in this dead town, announcing my presence to everything still capable of hearing. I had to move fast. I ran through side streets, using backyard fences and abandoned cars for cover. Behind me, moans rose in the gathering dusk. As more infected took up the hunt, they moved through the growing darkness with purpose, following my scent trail through neighborhoods that had once been safe havens for families and children. The sound of their pursuit drove me through a maze of memories made manifest. Past the Hendricks house, where I trick-or-treated every Halloween. Past the vacant lot where we'd played pickup baseball in the summers. Past the corner where I'd had my first kiss with Amy Peterson under a streetlight that no longer worked. All of it dead now. All of it transformed into something alien and hostile. The memory came flooding back with devastating clarity. That first morning when everything changed forever. I'd been asleep in my room dreaming about ordinary things, work schedules, weekend plans, a girl I'd been working up the courage to ask out. Then Mom was shaking me awake, her face pale with panic and something deeper, something that looked like grief for a world that was already gone. "Get dressed, honey. Get dressed now. We have to go." Her voice was steady, controlled, but I could hear the tremor underneath. She was still in her nightgown, hadn't even taken time to put on a robe, and her hands were shaking as she pulled clothes from my dresser. The radio was crackling from the kitchen, Dad's voice mixing with the emergency broadcasts as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Reports of widespread violence in Boston and Springfield. Authorities advising all residents to remain indoors. National Guard has been mobilized. I stumbled to the window, rubbing sleep from my eyes, and saw things that didn't make sense. Cars racing down our quiet street at dangerous speeds, some with suitcases strapped to their roofs like they were fleeing a natural disaster. The Modic house across the street had all its lights on, and I could see figures moving frantically behind the windows, packing, arguing, making desperate phone calls. "What's happening?" I asked, but Mom was already heading downstairs, where Dad's voice was getting louder, more urgent. In the kitchen, Dad stood over the radio like it was an altar, his face grave as he listened to reports that seemed to come from another world entirely. Attacks spreading rapidly through populated areas. Bite victims showing extreme aggressive behavior within hours. Medical facilities overwhelmed. "How bad is it?" Mom asked, and I saw Dad's hands clench into fists. "Bad enough that they're evacuating the entire county," he said. "Buses will be here in an hour. They're taking everyone north to some kind of emergency shelter. For how long? They don't know. They could be days, could be weeks. They just keep saying it's temporary, that they have everything under control." But I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe it. None of us did. We packed like we were going on a weekend trip. A few changes of clothes, toiletries, important documents stuffed into Dad's old briefcase. I grabbed my phone charger, my wallet, the $20 in tip money from my dresser. It all seemed so normal, so routine, like we were just taking a short vacation. Outside, sirens wailed constantly now, a soundtrack of chaos that grew louder with each passing minute. Emergency vehicles raced past our house toward downtown, their lights painting our windows in alternating red and blue. In the distance, I could see smoke rising from somewhere near the industrial district, thick black columns that stained the October sky. The buses arrived exactly when they promised, a convoy of yellow school buses that looked absurdly normal given the circumstances. Neighbors poured out of their houses carrying suitcases and children, pets and photo albums, all the things they couldn't bear to leave behind. Single file, a National Guard soldier shouted through a bullhorn, "Families stay together, no pushing." But there was pushing. There was panic barely held in check. Parents clutching children, elderly neighbors helped along by younger volunteers. Mrs. Patson from next door was crying as she locked her front door like she knew she'd never see her roses again. Mom held my hand so tight it hurt as we climbed aboard Bus 7. Her wedding ring cutting into my fingers like it was trying to leave a permanent mark. The bus was already half full, packed with faces I'd known my entire life. The Hendricks family from down the street, Mr. Carlson, who owned the hardware store, Amy Peterson and her parents. Amy's eyes red from crying as she stared out the window at her home. Dad sat across the aisle, staring out the window like he was memorizing every detail of our neighborhood. I watched him touch the glass with his fingertips, like he was trying to reach through it and hold on to something that was already disappearing. As the bus pulled away, I pressed my face to the window and watched Silence Falls shrink behind us. The last thing I saw was our house, small and ordinary and perfect, growing smaller in the distance until it was just another dot in a landscape that was already becoming a memory. "Don't worry," Dad said, his voice thick with emotion I didn't recognize then but understood now as grief. "We'll be back home soon. This will all blow over." But even as he said it, I could see the doubt in his eyes, and somewhere deep in my chest, in a place I didn't want to acknowledge, I felt the cold certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. I reached Pine Ridge Drive as the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of deep orange and purple that reminded me of childhood sunsets when the world had been predictable and safe. My neighborhood looked exactly as I'd left it 30 days ago. Neat houses with small lawns, driveways where cars sat waiting for owners who would never return. But there were differences, subtle ones that spoke of abandonment and slow decay. Newspapers piled up in driveways, yellow with age and rain damage. Dead plants in window boxes, their brown leaves scattered across front porches by November winds. The smell of things left too long without attention. Garbage, standing water, the gradual return of nature to spaces humans no longer maintained. And there, 4 houses down on the left, stood the blue house with white trim where I'd grown up, where Mom had made pancakes on Sunday mornings and Dad had taught me to change oil in the driveway, where I'd done homework at the kitchen table and complained about chores and dreamed about futures that seemed guaranteed. Home, or what was left of it. The front door stood slightly open, just a crack, like someone had left in a hurry and not bothered to pull it completely closed. But there was something else. A light in the front window, warm and yellow, like someone was still living there, like someone was waiting for me to come home. The warm yellow light in the front window flickered as I approached, like a candle guttering in the wind. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't candlelight at all. It was the automatic timer on the living room lamp, the same one Mom had set to turn on every evening at 6:30 to make the house look lived in when we were away. 30 days later, it was still keeping schedule, faithfully illuminating an empty house for no one. The front door had settled in its frame over the weeks, warped by November rains until it hung slightly crooked in the opening. I pushed it open slowly, rifle ready, listening for any sound that might indicate I wasn't alone. But there was only silence, the deep, heavy quiet of a house that had been holding its breath for too long. The living room lay before me exactly as we'd left it that frantic October morning. Dad's coffee mug sat on the end table next to his reading chair, a ring of dried residue marking where he'd set it down for the last time. The morning newspaper was still folded beside it, its headlines about local politics and school board meetings belonging to a world that no longer existed. Mom's knitting project lay in her basket beside the couch, a half-finished scarf in autumn colors that she'd been making for Dad's birthday. The needles were still positioned exactly where she'd left them, mid-stitch, waiting for hands that would never return to complete the pattern. I moved through the house like a ghost visiting his own past. In the kitchen, dishes sat in the drying rack where Mom had left them after doing the breakfast cleanup. The calendar on the wall still showed October with Dad's doctor appointment circled in red ink and Mom's book club meeting noted in her careful handwriting. Everything frozen in time, like we just stepped out for a few minutes and would be back any moment to resume our interrupted lives. The refrigerator hummed quietly, still running on whatever power grid was maintaining this pocket of normalcy. Inside, I found milk that had long since spoiled, leftovers that had transformed into unrecognizable science experiments, and a container of Mom's homemade soup that made my chest tighten with loss. But there were also things that had lasted, a jar of pickles that Dad loved, canned goods in the pantry, crackers that were stale but still edible. After 30 days of scraping for scraps and eating things I didn't want to identify, even stale crackers tasted like a feast. I sat at the kitchen table where I'd eaten thousands of meals, where I'd done homework under Mom's patient supervision, where we'd planned family vacations and discussed my future with the casual confidence of people who believed the future was guaranteed. The last conversation I'd had with them in this room had been about college applications. Dad pushing for state schools, practical choices with good job prospects. Mom wanting me to follow my dreams, whatever those might be. I'd been annoyed by their attention, impatient with their concern for my welfare. "You don't understand," I'd said, with the arrogance of youth. "Things are different now. The old rules don't apply anymore." How wrong I'd been. How right. As darkness settled over Silent Falls, I made my way upstairs to my old room. The bed was still unmade from that last morning, sheets tangled where I'd thrown them back when Mom woke me. Posters of bands I thought were important covered the walls. My desk held the detritus of a teenager's life. Old homework assignments, movie ticket stubs, a picture of me and Oliver and Danny from last summer's 4th of July celebration. We'd been so young then, barely 3 months ago. We'd believed we were adults, ready to take on the world, immortal in the way that only teenagers can be.
Now, two of them were dead, and I was something I didn't have a name for. Survivor, wanderer, ghost, haunting the ruins of his own life. I changed into clean clothes from my dresser. The simple act of putting on fresh socks and underwear, feeling like a luxury beyond measure. My old bed called to me, offering the promise of real sleep in a real bed for the first time in 30 days. But I couldn't risk it. Too exposed, too far from an exit if something went wrong. Instead, I made my way back downstairs and settled onto the living room couch where I'd watched countless movies with my parents, where we'd gathered for holiday mornings and lazy Sunday afternoons. The cushion still held the faint impression of our bodies, three people who'd taken their time together for granted. I placed the rifle within easy reach and tried to relax, but every sound made me tense. The house settling on its foundation, the automatic ice maker cycling in the kitchen, the heat kicking on to maintain a temperature for occupants who would never return. Outside, I could hear them moving through the darkness. Not many. Silent Falls had never been heavily populated, and most of the infected had probably wandered away from the town center by now, following sounds or scents that led them elsewhere. But some remained, drawn back to familiar places by instincts we didn't understand. Occasionally, one would shuffle past the house, its footsteps dragging across the asphalt like a broken promise. I would hold my breath until the sound faded, then try to convince myself to sleep. But sleep felt like surrender, like letting my guard down in a world that punished such weakness. The darkness pressed against the windows like something alive, and I found myself staring at the ceiling, counting the cracks in the plaster that had been there since childhood. This house had been my sanctuary once, the place where I was safe from everything the world might throw at me. Now it felt like a museum exhibit, a careful recreation of a life that had ended without warning. I thought about Emma from the pharmacy, holed up in her grandmother's house with her kitchen knife and her determination to survive. Was she lying awake too, listening to the sounds of the dead world outside? Did she regret the choices that had brought her to this moment? Or had she made peace with the reality of what we'd become? And what about the children I'd heard about at the school? Were they really trapped in some basement nightmare? Or had that been the delusion of a traumatized survivor who'd seen too much horror to distinguish reality from hallucination? The questions multiplied in the darkness, each one spawning others until my mind was a chaos of doubt and speculation. But beneath them all was one fundamental truth. I couldn't stay here. This wasn't home anymore, if it ever really had been. Home was the people, not the place, and the people were gone. This house was just a collection of objects now, artifacts from a life that had ended the moment those evacuation buses pulled away from the high school. Keeping the lights on and the heat running didn't make it alive any more than preserving bodies made them human. Sometime after midnight, exhaustion finally overcame anxiety, and I drifted into fitful sleep. I dreamed of Sunday mornings and pancake breakfasts, of Dad teaching me to drive in the empty parking lot behind the church, of Mom reading bedtime stories in a voice that made even the scariest tales feel safe. But the dreams twisted as they always did now. The pancakes were made from something that wasn't flour. Dad's driving lessons took place on roads littered with corpses. Mom's bedtime stories were about children who never grew up because the world ended before they had the chance. I woke just before dawn, sunlight streaming through the living room windows to illuminate dust motes that danced in the air like tiny ghosts. For a moment, in that space between sleep and full consciousness, I forgot where I was, forgot what had happened. The familiar sounds and smells of home convinced me that everything else had been a nightmare, that I would hear Mom's voice from the kitchen any moment asking if I wanted coffee. But the moment passed, as it always did, and reality reasserted itself with brutal clarity. I made coffee anyway, using the last of the grounds in the cupboard and water from a tap that still ran clear and cold.
The routine was comforting, normal, a small act of defiance against the chaos outside. I sat at the kitchen table and watched the sun rise over Silent Falls, painting the dead town in shades of gold and amber that made it look almost peaceful. From this angle, you couldn't see the abandoned cars or the boarded windows. You couldn't smell the decay or hear the distant moans of the infected. It looked like home, like the place where I'd grown up safe and loved and certain that tomorrow would always come. But that was an illusion, and illusions were dangerous things in this new world. I finished my coffee and washed the cup, leaving it in the drying rack next to the others. A small gesture of respect for the house that had sheltered me one last time, for the parents who'd raised me here, for the boy I'd been, who'd believed the future was something you could plan for. Then I gathered my gear and headed for the front door. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of wood smoke from some distant fire. Somewhere in Silent Falls, something was burning, adding its smoke to the funeral pyre of civilization. But the sun was shining, and the world was waking up to another day of survival and loss, and the small victories that kept us going. I looked back at the house one last time, memorizing its lines and angles, storing the image in a place where grief couldn't touch it. Then I started walking. Pine Ridge Drive stretched out before me, leading away from the past and toward whatever came next. I didn't know where I was going, didn't have a plan B beyond putting one foot in front of the other. But that had been enough to get me this far. Maybe it would be enough to carry me through whatever lay ahead. Behind me, the automatic timer would keep turning the lights on and off, maintaining its faithful vigil over an empty house. The heat would continue to run, keeping the temperature comfortable for ghosts. The refrigerator would hum its quiet song to no one. All the small machines of daily life, carrying on their tasks without purpose or meaning, like prayers offered up to gods who had stopped listening. But I was done with prayers, done with looking backward, done with believing that home was a place you could return to instead of something you carried with you. The road stretched ahead, bleeding out of Silent Falls and into a world where the only certainty was uncertainty, where survival meant accepting that everything you'd once believed about safety and permanence had been a comfortable lie. I adjusted the rifle strap on my shoulder and started walking toward the sunrise, leaving the blue house with white trim to its memories and its shadows. Behind me, Silent Falls settled back into its eternal quiet. A town full of ghosts and empty houses, and the echoes of lives interrupted mid-sentence. And somewhere in that silence, the automatic timer clicked on, flooding an empty living room with warm yellow light that no one would ever see again.